Good evening. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims. I'm the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are pleased to welcome to campus this evening the Right Honourable Ed Miliband, Member of Parliament for Doncaster North and former leader of the Labour Party in the UK. It's a special pleasure for me, as I recently returned to Chicago after living for 3 years in London, where I was working on policy for a nonprofit organization. I miss a lot about my time there, fish and chips, the tube, even the Queen, but I really miss British politics. So it is a true treat to get this extraordinary dose of Britain's best political intelligence this evening. A few words about our upcoming events. Tomorrow in this room, we're hosting a conversation with Zalmay Khalilzad, former US Ambassador to the United Nations. Thursday at Rockefeller Chapel, David Axelrod will be sitting down for a conversation with former White House Senior Advisor Valerie Jarrett. Next Monday, we'll welcome Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper. You can find out more about these and all of our upcoming events on our website at politics.uchicago.edu. We will open up the floor for audience questions after the conversation. Please line up behind the microphone in the center aisle. As usual, we give priority for the first 3 questions to students, and we remind you that questions end with a question mark. In addition, please make sure that your phones are on silent. Restrooms can be found on the first floor. And now, here to formally introduce our speaker is Karl Sakhalin. Karl is a first year from London, studying political science. In addition to serving as an events ambassador for the IOP Speaker Series, Karl writes about European politics for The Gate, UChicago's undergraduate political review. Please join me in welcoming Karl to the podium.
Good evening and welcome to the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. It is a great honor to be introducing our speaker for tonight's event. On June 23, 2016, the British people voted to leave the European Union. It's fair to say it was a decision that shook the British political bubble to its core, and to this day, almost 2 years later, it still manages to dominate the headlines. Other European nations have seen similar shake-ups since the referendum. In Germany, for instance, the AfD became the 3rd largest party. Meanwhile, in France, Marine Le Pen made it to the final round of the presidential election. And in Hungary, we've seen a slow but steady descent towards authoritarianism. Fueled by nationalism and populism, these are clearly testing times. Who better to hear from them than the Right Honourable Ed Miliband? His expertise, accumulated at the highest echelons of British government, gives him a unique insight into the state of British politics today. Following several years as an advisor to then Chancellor Gordon Brown, Mr. Miliband was elected as the MP for Doncaster North in 2005. Just 2 years later, he was promoted to the front benches, and eventually he became Secretary of State for the Department of Energy and Climate Change, where he worked on reducing greenhouse emissions. In 2010, following nominations from his party colleagues, Ed Miliband became the leader of the Labour Party and went on to serve as the leader of the opposition for the next 5 years. Since then, he has used his platform to tirelessly raise progressive arguments and has been an important voice in the debate surrounding worker provisions following Brexit. All in all, Ed Miliband's wealth of experience at the highest levels of British politics will certainly make for an interesting conversation. The conversation will be moderated by former senior advisor to President Obama and the Institute of Politics Director, David Axelrod. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage, and, well, they're already here actually, David Axelrod and the Right Honourable Ed Miliband.
Thank you, Karl. How did you get this particular gig? I don't know. Gretchen, listening to Karl's introduction, I can see why you're so nostalgic for British and European politics. It sounds like everything's going swimmingly over there. But, things are very calm here.
I noticed.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what's going on your side of the pond, and actually what's going on in both our countries.
Yeah.
I should say, as a matter of full disclosure, that we're good friends. I worked with Ed on his campaign, on Labour's campaign in 2015. And one of the major debates in that campaign was about Brexit. The Tories were under, and David Cameron, who's the Prime Minister, was under great pressure from Nigel Farage and UKIP, anti-Europe, wanted Brexit, and in order to secure the support of some of those voters, he proposed a referendum and said he would oppose. You were opposed to that.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about why you were opposed to it, because there were plenty of folks in the labor world who were for Brexit as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting, it was a really interesting dilemma for me because there was a lot of pressure from within my shadow cabinet, the shadow government. Kameron made this promise, I believe, in 2013, I think I'm right in saying. And there was a lot of pressure to follow him because he said, I'm going to let the people decide. And I thought about it for some considerable time. I mean, in the end, I wasn't in my heart for a referendum. Why not? Because I thought, actually, this isn't the issue that most people care about. When you looked at, in those days, when you looked at Europe as an issue, it was sort of 7th, 8th, 9th in top of people's priorities. The call for a referendum was coming from a particularly vocal bunch of people who wanted us out of the European Union. And I thought the country had bigger problems that it needed to address. And I didn't want us to leave. So why would I have a referendum? But, you know, the pull of politics, in a way, it's quite a good little example, or big example, because the pull of politics, you know, pulls you in a number of directions. I remember talking to Tony Blair about this and to get his view. And he said, look, trust me, do not do this, because you will spend every waking moment as Prime Minister in the run-up to this referendum thinking only about the referendum. There'll be no bandwidth for anything else. So I decided not to have...
You should have mentioned that to Kameron.
He probably did mention it to Kameron. I don't know. I decided not to do it. I lost the election. We had the referendum, and
Kameron really bet his leadership on winning that referendum.
I mean, he thought he was a winner.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, I don't know whether this story is apocryphal, but it's a good story, so I'll tell it anyway. He apparently said at the last European heads of government meeting, the European Council, 27 other people sitting around, as he got his referendum deal, the deal he takes to the people, he said, just remember, he said, I'm a winner, which sadly turned out not to be true in relation to
You sure he didn't
Brexit.
say I'm a goner?
Well, that was later.
Maybe they misheard.
That was later.
But in truth, it was a very, very close
It was.
referendum, 52-48.
Yeah.
And we were talking about this earlier. What was striking to me, I was over there in the fall. We were doing some panels for the university on Brexit, and in looking at the demographics of that vote, it was striking how much it resembled the vote in the U.S. in
Definitely.
2016.
Definitely.
So the Trump voters were very much aligned in their demographics with the Brexit voters. The Remain voters were very much aligned with American Clinton voters. The Remain voters were metropolitan, tended to be more highly educated, and the Leave voters were rural, older.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the
educated.
single most important thing I would say about Brexit is to understand the Brexit vote is look beneath the surface. I mean, it's true of anything, but it's true particularly in this case. So my constituency, Doncaster North, 72% voted for Brexit, one of the top 5 or 6 in the whole of the United Kingdom. They obviously didn't listen to me. I was for Remain. But you know, as I did go round and ask...
Talk about what your constituency is.
An ex-mining constituency. If you went to Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan, I think you'd see quite a similar demographic, quite a similar ex-industrial area. You know, talk to people about this referendum. And I remember the woman who said to me the day after the referendum, and I know politicians tell anecdotes and they make them up, but I promise you I'm not making it up. She said to me, oh, well, the reason I voted Leave was because of immigration. And I said, was that the only reason? And she said, no, I voted for a new beginning for my grandchildren. And yeah, Jesus, somebody says. But I mean, in a way, your response is interesting because, but who said Jesus? Oh yeah, hello. You're not so convinced, but look, this is what's so interesting about this, and I think it's also, as David is implying with his question, translatable to Trump. Look, people felt that the political system had failed them. People felt the political and economic system had failed them, and they felt there was this was a big moment to demand change. And some of it was specifically the change that was being offered, tighter controls on immigration, more money for the health service, a lot of which won't come to pass. But some of it was a lot of it was emotion and much deeper than that. It was, and so Kameron went around, saying, look, trust me, things are really good at the moment. And my constituents saying, well, hang on a minute, things aren't really good for us. We worry that our kids are going to have worse chances than us. We worry about our own wages, lives, and what's happening. We see huge inequality in the country. We see a banking crisis where no banker went to jail and nobody paid the price apart from us. So don't tell us things are good. And if you're telling us things are good and this is why we should vote for Remain, we're going to vote Brexit. And so,
what about
I think that's the deep lesson of this. And I think it's got much wider implications for the left across the world, actually.
Well, let me ask you about the first part of her answer,
Yeah.
which is immigration.
Yeah.
What is the demographic makeup of your constituency?
Very small numbers of immigrants, but, and I think this is an important but, the specific thing about Britain, which people often don't get, which is different from the rest of Europe, is we have the collision of significant amounts of immigration with a highly deregulated labour market. Basically, employers can do what they want, more or less. And I think the combination, the economists will say it makes no difference to wages, it doesn't have any impact. I personally think that the impact might be small in aggregate, but when you look at in specific circumstances, what people were feeling was, look, you've got employers who are bringing in low-wage foreign labour. And the economists will know this, the reservation wage, the wage at which people are willing to work, might well be lower for somebody from Poland or Romania than it is for somebody in the UK for a whole host of different reasons. Because if you look at the Polish minimum wage or the Romanian minimum wage, is obviously much lower. So I think it does have some effect. Some of it, a lot of it might be perception, but some of it is probably real.
And you meant that there are lots of immigrants from the countries that you mentioned. There also was an influx of immigrants over the last several years, Syrian immigrants and immigrants from elsewhere. How much does race play into it?
I mean, not as much as lots of people would say. I mean, I think, to sort of go to the nub of maybe of your question, yes, there are people who are racist who voted for Brexit, but the vast majority of people who voted for Brexit are not racist I don't believe. And I think there's a real danger on the left that we dismiss Trump voters or Brexit voters as basically a bunch of racists, and we ignore the deeper economic, I hesitate to say a basket of deplorables, but you get my drift. That we dismiss the deeper economic concerns.
Yeah, but the question is whether there's a cultural overlay that is. I mean, there's this. I guess my theory, and one of the prerogatives of the moderator is to impose my theory on you and then have you knock it down.
Yeah.
Is that we live in a time of this revolutionary change in our economy, and if you're on the right side of that digital divide, it offers enormous opportunity. Most of the people in this room will be the beneficiaries of that. But it's also a time of cultural change. And I want to talk in a minute about the media landscape and how we communicate with each other. But people are being bombarded with change. And the immigration piece was one more piece that seemed to be rapidly changing what, let me put it in the American context. There was this perception that somehow America was changing, that we were becoming a more diverse country, and whether people were motivated by race or not, just the assault of all of this change at once was kind of amalgamated.
I mean, at the risk of looking like I'm trying to have my cake and eat it,
or stick up for your constituents.
I think it's both.
Yeah.
Look, I think it can be both. I think they call it overdetermined. You know, both cultural change and some of its economic side effects and economic dislocation. And I think you could argue Brexit wouldn't have happened. Perhaps it wouldn't have happened without the Blair government made a decision in the early 2000s to not impose a transitional controls when it came to migration from Poland. You know, maybe that was a big factor because it definitely increased the number of people coming in. That's big cultural change. But equally, it wouldn't have happened without the economic dislocation that people were feeling. So I think...
Well, when you lose 52-48, there are a number of factors.
Exactly. So I think both of them are there. I think it is obviously, you know, it would be wrong to be overly just to be economically determinist about this. But I tend to, the reason I kind of focus on the economy part of it is I think there's a limit to what sacrifice I'm willing to make of the values of multiculturalism and sort of, you know, modernity, openness. But I think there's big change that needs to happen in our economy. So I think there's kind of more that the left can do about the latter than they can about the former.
Mm-hmm. Well, look at Europe writ large. We've talked about the U.S. and Britain, but you've had these really sort of titanic shifts in Europe away from kind of the forces of liberal democracy in the direction
Viktor
of
Orban
authoritarian.
just being re-elected in Hungary.
And a lot, and again, if you look at the overlay of some of the voting patterns, it's the same. It's more rural than urban. It's you know, people with less formal education. It's people who are not on the winning side of this economic divide, and it feels as if democracy on both sides of the Atlantic has real challenges as a result. So, because I know you think a lot about this, what's the answer, Ed?
I mean, I will answer the question, but I mean, I do think one part of the answer is that the lesson of the past, that capitalism only survives if there's fairness, was sort of forgotten. I think, and I hold this, by the way, I think part of the lesson of politics in general is to have some humility and accept one's own responsibility. I think the centre-left sort of thought implicitly, explicitly, yeah, well, look, you know, globalization is producing really difficult things, trade, technology, and so on, but like the working class voters don't really have anywhere else to go. Mm-hmm. You know, it's kind of where else are they going to go? Now, in the US in 2016, they went to Trump. In the UK, they went to Brexit. That's the place they had to go. So I think part of the answer.
You saw the election in Italy, where two populist
just
parties.
Had the election in Italy as well. You know, and it's sort of yeah. So where does that take you? I think in the end you've got to offer big change and big hope to people. Now it can't be false hope, but say what you like about Trump and Brexit. And look, I'm not in favour of either of them, or wasn't in favour of Brexit. And I'm certainly not in favour of Trump. They offer the semblance of big change, a sense that things are going to be different. And so I think you've got to be able to answer whether it's on wages or hope for young people or the investment in people's communities, a sense that things can be different in a bolder way. And I think it's not coincidental that the Democratic Party is moving to the left, that Bernie Sanders did so much better in the primaries in 2016 than anyone would have expected, that Jeremy Corbyn did so much better at the 2017 general election than anyone could have expected. I think it speaks to some of these anxieties and some of these demands for big change.
I want to get to Corbyn.
Yeah.
On this issue of authoritarianism, though, one of the concerns that I have is that, as I said, everything's moving so rapidly. Technology is changing our economies so rapidly. The way we communicate is siloing people in ways that, where you have your opinions affirmed rather than informed, and we're not having one discussion. But there's this sense of constant motion and challenge. And democracies are built to be somewhat lumbering.
Yeah, we were talking about this the other night,
Yeah. And, I certainly feel that here. There's a great frustration with the pace at which government responds and the way in which government responds to problems and the influence of special interests. I'm sure you have your version of that same thing. Is democracy built to respond to these challenges?
I mean, it's a really good question. I was doing a session with the students earlier. Somebody, the last question, who asked the last question of me? If they're here, maybe they. Yes, this lady asked this last question, which was, I'm not saying it was better than your question at all, but she asked a version.
You said if you come to the event, I'll answer that question.
A version of that question, which was, correct me if I get this wrong, which was, how do you get big change at the same time as keeping the country together, given that there's such divergence in the country?
That's not my question, but it's a better question.
Well, I mean, it's a
so answer that one.
It's hard to answer. I mean, it's a version of that question. And we were talking about this the other night, and I said, look, FDR did it in the 1930s in the United States. And you said it was the Great Depression that
Great Depression. Plus, he totally dominated social media.
So I gather he had a good Twitter presence. So I think in a way, the combination of your two questions, I'm going to kind of dig myself out of this one in relation to your question now. The combination of your two questions is really important, but I think unless the left, I think the left, which is obviously my part of politics, but you could equally apply it to parts of the right too, the right that is skeptical about this nationalism. Unless the left and the right can come up with big answers to some of these problems that people are posing, I think the awful, simplistic, blame the immigrants, blame the others solutions take hold. And I think it's very hard to sort of say to people, yeah, but that solution is like completely wrong. And then they say, well, what have you got to offer? And you say, well, some, tinkering around the edges.
Yeah, but just getting back to the challenges of democracy, I mean, FDR had big majorities and passed his program in the midst of a massive national emergency. But generally, you don't have big majorities. You have a different issue. Parliamentary system is different. In our country, you have to compromise in order to get things done. So big things are hard to accomplish because you have to, to the frustration of people.
Let me put a counter case here, and I'm not trying to turn this into the reverse the Q&A here, but don't you think that part of it is that the sort of 1990s so-called third way, which was the sort of Clinton-Blair approach to politics, emphasized to a fault the sort of incremental over the big change? I mean, don't you think that was... So in a way, you're right, government is lumbering. How do you bring a country together? Yeah. It's not the Great Depression. Not everyone can be FDR. That's all true. But I think somewhere along the way, we slightly forgot that the solution has to match the problem.
Well, we don't all forget. I mean, I was in an administration that did, the Affordable Care Act and a bunch of other stuff.
But in a way, it was a change, I would say, wasn't it?
A change from what the norm.
Yeah, mm-hmm. I mean, it was a big. You went for bigger solutions than maybe the 1992-2000 era.
We did, yeah, and we got. I mean, and I'm not here as a partisan. I'm not here, and this isn't a partisan institute, but just speaking for myself, I'm very proud of what we got done in the first 2 years, which is when I was there. But we also got our butts kicked in the midterm elections, and then for the next 6 years, it was a real scuffle. Yeah. So I don't know the answers to these things either, but I know that these are problems that we have to address, because if people feel betrayed by the system writ large, I mean, I think you're right. Capitalists need to be concerned about this, because if you lose your constituency among a broad swath of people because the economy is not working for them, then not only capitalism but democracy.
I mean, this is
is
how.
at
I mean,
risk.
in a way, this is what was interesting.
It's turning into a kind of a dark discussion.
No. It's not meant to be. It's not
Talk about the Red Sox.
It's not meant to be dark. I've got a podcast, by the way, as well as him, which is called Reasons to Be Cheerful. So just that this, you should all listen to it as well as to his. But I mean, in a way, the thing that brought us together in a very long transatlantic phone conversation was precisely about these questions, which is people feel they live in an era when hard work isn't rewarded, when their kids can't get on, and the left, the
Yes.
centre left, has to speak big style to those challenges. President Obama, I think, shortly afterwards gave that speech, and was it Oswatomi?
Osawatomie. Yeah.
Osawatomie, sorry,
Yeah,
forgive my
that's okay.
pronunciation.
That's all right.
Which was all about these big questions.
Yes. Yeah, and that was a lot of what that campaign was about. I talked about the media environment. One of the differences between Britain and the U.S. is we do have obviously some very dominant networks here that are playing big in our politics, but money plays big in our politics in a way that it doesn't in British politics. And explain how the British media is, the role that the British media plays in your campaigns.
So, I mean, we have the good news, the good thing about Britain is that we have very strict rules on political, you can't advertise on television. We have quite low spending limits by American standards, I think £20 million or thereabouts, maybe a bit more for general elections. I mean, the bad news is, from the left point of view, is that we are very dominated by a right-wing newspaper industry, the Sun, the Daily Mail, and others. They do define quite a lot of the mood music and the psychology of politics. I think they are becoming less powerful as a result of social media. And I think, in a way, one of the reasons why Jeremy Corbyn succeeded in 2017 more than people expected was that he used social media to get around those traditional avenues. Facebook, Twitter, all of those things were just, and they hadn't been used quite in the way he used them at the general election. So, I mean, I think it always felt for me, maybe I would say this, as leader of the opposition, much harder to be a Labour leader in the British context. You felt like you were, kicking the football uphill.
Yes.
Because of the
Or
press.
maybe you were being kicked.
Well, maybe because of that too, because of the press that we had. But in a sense, what are you going to do? That's just part of a free society. You've got to find ways around it, really.
One of the media figures who we share is Rupert Murdoch,
Yep.
who plays big on both sides
I'm
of
not so keen on him, really, actually.
Yeah, you've
Spoiler
had
alert.
Yes. I see a bunch of shocked expressions
Yeah,
on
exactly.
people's faces out here. But you've been involved in a long battle to try and prevent him from taking over a majority share of Sky News, which is a big outlet. He already owns a bunch of the print press. Talk about that and what the prospects are. And we should just say we don't know what the genesis of this was, but the Murdoch offices were raided today by
Not by me.
regulators from the European Union.
Yeah. So, I mean, this all started in 2011 because it was revealed that the News of the World, which was a publication that he owned, had phone hacked the phone of a girl who'd been tragically, a young teenager who'd been tragically kidnapped and murdered. And it led to a big sort of self-examination of the press. It led to a whole set of criminal convictions for phone hacking. A number of people went to jail who'd worked for the News of the World at various moments. A big judicial inquiry into the press, which in the end slightly ran into the ground because the inquiry had good recommendations, but they were sort of ignored by the government once it became safe to do so. But he had been trying to take over Sky News. My fear was, and still is, that it becomes like Fox News. We don't want a Fox News in the UK. for reasons you probably will understand.
Happy to share.
Yeah. So we're in this ongoing, and he dropped the bid after these 2011 revelations, and we're now back in this tussle because he's trying to take it over, and I, along with some other politicians, are trying to stop it happening. In a way, by the way, there's a bigger interesting thing for me here, which was it was very much not the playbook to take on Murdoch. I mean, me taking him on, which I did in the wake of these phone hacking revelations, I called for Rebecca Brooks, who was his chief lieutenant, to resign from her position. She did eventually resign. I called for the inquiry. It was not the way politics had been done, because politics had been done on both sides for a long time, that the way you succeed is by cozying up to Rupert Murdoch. So it's sort of interesting, and you know, I think it has broken his spell a bit, but not completely.
Any forecast on how that's going to end up?
I mean, I hope that we will succeed, but it's hard to tell.
You talk about social media and the role that it played in the Corbyn's performance. He didn't win, but he did far better than anybody anticipated in 2017. What about the role of Russia in the Brexit election and the role of Russia in Britain generally, including the poisoning of two Russians in London recently? Russia's being pretty muscular, not in Britain and throughout Europe.
Totally. And
not here.
Totally, yeah. Look, it's deeply concerning, the attacks on two people in the UK. I think Theresa May has been right to do what she did. I think it speaks to a larger context, though, which is, I'm afraid this doesn't speak well for Britain, which is that we have become too much a sort of no questions asked place for people to come if they've got wealth and riches, and no questions are really asked about where the riches come from. There are 80,000 or something properties held by anonymous shell companies in the UK, mainly in London, to the tune of large amounts of money. It doesn't do great things for our housing market. The general philosophy has been we want people who are wealthy to come. I understand the reasons for that, but it's been far too lax. And throw into the mix that we've got these offshore tax territories, British Virgin Islands, others, which are easy places to kind of channel your money through. And it's a kind of, and you know, London's a nice place to live. So it's a kind of alluring combination. So I think any action in relation to Russia has to do the kind of traditional diplomat, you know, kick out the diplomats, but it's also got to do something deeper than that, which is speak to this question of how we allow Putin's cronies and others to launder money through London. Because I think that is the thing that would actually have some impact.
And what about the issue of what Russia's doing all over the globe in terms of it's a cheap and easy way to disrupt democracies. Democracies are open. They rely on the free flow of information. You know, you talked about some of the fault lines in your society. We have them here. The Russians have proven themselves very deft at identifying those fault lines and exploiting them. Yeah,
and you know, nobody wants a new Cold War, but I think we've been too sort of sanguine about some of what has gone on. But I'll also say this. I mean, if we're talking about areas where we've been too sanguine, and obviously we're talking on the day that Mark Zuckerberg testified before Congress, I think that is an area, you talk about the lumbering nature of government. I think government has been massively lumbering when it comes to technology. That we've been caught between a sort of Luddite tendency that says, you know, stop the world, I want to get off, and a tendency that said, isn't this all wonderful? We get all this free stuff.
But isn't there a third thing, which is to say, we don't want government controlling the internet, that we want the internet to be a place where of free expression?
Yeah, it's got to be a place of free expression, but I mean, you know, Facebook are now responding that they're going to do some rather basic things like tell you who paid for the ads and all of that, which
overdue.
Which are long overdue. And also, look, the other thing, I think the other tradition that the left has to recapture is a great American progressive tradition, which is a sort of anti-monopoly tradition. I mean, I think somewhere along the way we lost that too, that we were so keen to show that we were like on the side of business and wealth creation, which is a good thing to be, that we, okay, Facebook is Facebook, but does it really need to own Instagram and all of the other things that it owns? And when you had that challenge in the 20th century in the US, or I think it was around AT&T, in the end you broke it up because there's that important strand of American politics, more than Britain actually, which says monopoly power, which is sort of unaccountable, is not a good thing.
Yeah, I actually believe that may end up being a theme for a Democratic nominee in 2020 here, because that's a populist theme that has broad currency and maybe less destructive impulses than others. Or ramifications.
And look, we've got, and the other, just to add to this, I mean, there's obviously the huge challenges about the power you want Facebook to have and others, but there's also, a massive presenting question of the next 10 or 15 years is if we're worried about inequality now, what is it going to be like in the era of sort of, driverless cars, all of this wealth accumulating in particular technology giants, and what are we going to do to do something about it? I think one of the most interesting interviews Hillary Clinton gave after the election, and I know some people haven't been keen on some of what she said, was she said that she thought about this idea of the universal basic income. Some people will know about this. This is the idea you replace the welfare system with one flat rate payment to everybody. And she thought about having what she called an Alaska for America, based on the Alaska dividend scheme, but making it nationwide. She said she couldn't make the numbers add up. But I think, when we're talking about big answers, there are some people who are skeptical about the so-called UBI, but the thing I say to them is, okay, fine to be skeptical, but at least it's thinking about big scale, about how we're going to cope with this massive disruption and potential greater inequality that technology is going to produce.
This is the critique of you talked before about the right and the left, and there is a tendency to be responsive to the activist bases of both parties, leaving many feeling just sort of homeless in this whole debate. The criticism of Corbyn has been that he's positioned himself, you would argue, big ideas, and that's what's required, not the same old sort of incremental pablum. So he's talking about nationalizing some industries and renationalizing some industries and so on. Others say that he goes too far and that you limit your ability to win.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, as you say, I'm in the first camp. I mean, I'm reminded of something which is slightly painful for me, but it was a very good line that you used, so I'll sort of succumb to the pain. I mean, you said at one point when I was describing my policy program, this can't be free microwaves for all.
yes.
And you can see why it was painful. And okay, partly you were saying it can't just be free stuff for everybody, but I think you were saying something bigger, which is, and I tried to do this, but it's not successfully enough. You've got to give people a big sense of vision. And I think one of the things about Corbyn it's worth saying is we can focus on the programmatic, and the programmatic is important. But as you know, and as you told me in lots of times, maybe I didn't listen enough, people in the end don't read the 32-point program.
Yeah.
They get a general...
Well, Hillary Clinton had a lengthy list of programs.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Donald Trump's was,
Short.
yes. Not sweet, but short.
Short,
yeah.
short and more successful.
Yeah.
And in a way, I think it's partly that, that it's so interesting for me because in my constituency, I think it's fair to say that there was a large degree of skepticism about Jeremy Corbyn at the beginning of the election campaign. And if the election campaign had been held on the first day, the election had been held on the first day of the campaign, we would have done a lot worse. But I found even the people who were skeptical about him were saying by the end, well, I don't that much like the guy, but he talks a lot of sense, I've got to say. And when they said he's talking a lot of sense, they weren't talking about, maybe they were saying, we think really what they were thinking was the railways in Britain don't seem to work very well. In the rest of Europe, they're in public ownership. Why can't we have something like that? And there was a sort of common sense big picture that he was, as well as the programmatic, which I think is partly what he was doing. But sure, some people do feel politically homeless.
And do you think there's Lib Dems were deflated in the 2015 election. They were sort of a centrist party. They made a decision. I'm sorry, in 2015, 2010, they made a decision to go into the government with the Tories. That turned out to be a bad decision for them. So is there even a vehicle for another party to emerge that would be other than, factional, regional parties?
So there is quite a debate in Britain, at least written by journalists, saying, is there going to be a new party that emerges to, some combination of disaffected, Tories disaffected with Theresa May, Labour people disaffected with Jeremy Corbyn? I am personally sceptical. I mean, I'm both sceptical about the idea being a good one, deeply sceptical, and I'm also sceptical it's going to happen. I think partly the British political system doesn't lend itself to this because it's a parliamentary system. You've got to run in 650 districts if you're going to succeed. What we've seen with Emmanuel Macron in France, partly is a result of just a very different presidential system. Where he could sort of set up a new party, win the presidential election from nowhere. But sure,
what do you think of him, by the way?
I don't know. Is the honest answer? I think
he's challenging Labour there.
Yeah. I mean, I for my sort of personally, I'm sort of the jury's out on it. I don't know what he's going to produce. I mean, he's not where I would position myself politically. But let's see what he does. I think it is. I understand the appeal of the beyond left and right business. I think it ends.
Well, that sounds like an echo of how you were describing the '90s.
Yeah, a bit, but I think it's quite hard to pull it off in these circumstances. I mean, I don't know. I'm skeptical, but we'll see what happens.
We're going to take questions in a minute and 22 seconds.
I know. If you've got,
so set your watches.
Here, yeah.
Set your watches, and there's the microphone. So if you have questions, please line up behind that microphone. I can't finish my time without asking you about the climate issue because you were the minister on climate before you became the leader. And you were involved in the first iteration in Copenhagen of trying to put a world pact together. Ultimately, it happened in Paris. I asked you this earlier, but I want to do it in front of this group. How much is the? We're going to keep doing this until we get it right.
Exactly.
How much
That's
is
what you used to say to me.
How much is the withdrawal of the U.S. From that, and some of the environmental decisions that have been made here? How impactful is that on the world?
I mean, I think it is bad, and I know that kind of sounds like a banality to say it, but I think it's great that U.S. states, California and others, are trying to fill the gap. It's really important, but
there is a sense that there's a bunch of momentum that's going to be hard to stop.
Yeah, it's not going to stop the momentum, but it might slow the momentum, and we have not a moment to waste when it comes to this issue, because. I know I'm going to use all the cliches here, but it is genuinely a race against time. We've got 1 degree of warming already. When you see, this is going to say quite a lot about me, but I spent part of my family holiday in 2016 in the Arctic, which was really nice for my kids. But the Norwegian Arctic is quite cold. But not cold. But not cold enough.
I'm glad it's still cold.
But not cold enough. And you see the retreat of the glaciers. You see all of this stuff happening. Parts of America, parts of the world are already living. Many parts of the world are already living with the effects of climate change. It's not some theoretical thing down the road. The thing that I was involved in the 2009 Copenhagen summit, which was a bit of a disaster. I remember President Obama arriving at that summit and thinking, you could see him thinking, what have I got myself into here? But part of what has changed is the will from China and India, and up to Trump, until Trump happened, America, to actually do stuff. And, the European Union too. So it will set, the sooner we get different climate leadership, the better.
What do your constituents in that former mining and manufacturing town feel about climate change, and how do they prioritize it?
More skeptical, because it's an ex-coal mining area. younger generation less so. But in a way, partly, and we discussed this on the podcast, we've got to give people a sense of there being a fair transition. And I think in a way, if I have a critique of the otherwise excellent climate justice movement, of which I consider myself part, we haven't brought climate justice and economic justice closely enough together. Too often it's like climate change has sat in this box with this is a kind of global emergency. Yes, it is. We've got to do something about it. But I think to bring people with you, you need the just transition.
Mm-hmm. Let's take some questions.
Hi, Mr. Miliband. My name's Xavier. I'm originally from Barnsley, which, for context, is quite near.
Very
Doncaster.
near.
Yeah. So
when did you leave Barnsley?
I was pretty young, but we go
Right.
back every year.
You've got a slightly mid-Atlantic accent, haven't you?
Yeah, somewhere out in the ocean.
Yeah.
So I'd just like to preface my question by saying I do personally have a lot of support for the policies and initiatives you push. But I would like to know, as someone who's relatively, proud of Northern heritage, as someone who grew up in the South, went to Oxford, LSE,
Yeah.
what steps do you take to kind of relate to and stay in touch with the community you represent?
It's a good question. So spend time there, try and fight for the area. I was talking about this to David earlier. I made no bones about the fact that I didn't come from Doncaster. They'd always had somebody local, or at least for as long as anyone could remember. And I said right from the outset, look, I'm not a local person.
You had no connection with the constituency.
No, I'm not a local person. There were it was a local Labour Party members, so that's people who are members of the party, 400 people or so, who made the decision. There were people from Doncaster on the list that they could vote for. I said, look, I offer something different. I want to help open doors for this constituency. And this constituency system, I know you have it in the US, it's such an important thing for keeping you grounded in what is the reality of what's actually happening. And, it's so interesting for me to just take the Brexit issue. I've got lots of Remain friends, but I have a constituency that was very Brexit. I think that helps inform my perspective. But, I was very clear when I lost the election in 2015, I didn't want to leave politics. And one of the reasons is because I get too much out of being a backbench MP. I mean, get too much out of it in the sense that I'm very proud to be the MP for Doncaster North and very proud to fight for my constituency.
Thank you.
Mr. Miliband, thank you for coming.
Please do call me Ed, is that all right? I know that's a bit of British informality, but...
We don't allow that.
Right, okay, fine. Actually, just before you ask your question, Mitt Romney had a disastrous visit to the UK, and I was unwittingly when he was a candidate against President Obama, and I was unwittingly part of the author of this because he called me Mr. Leader in the two-way press conference that we did. Now, the British press, nice as they are, said it was because he didn't know my name. And so he thought Mr. Leader was a safe harbour for him. But it sort of contributed to the sense that he said we weren't ready for the Olympics and all that. Anyway, sorry, lots
After
of...
that, he wore a big button that said Ed.
Exactly. Don't call me Mr. Leader, but go ahead.
Yeah, so Scotland used to be Labour's heartland. And many people speculate that Brexit may be Scotland's chance at independence. And both Labour and Tories are for hard Brexit, while the Scotland National Party is for a soft one, many for economic reasons. And they say that under hard Brexit, that is under WTO rule, an average loss of £2,300 will be incurred per person per year in 2030, compared with the continued EU membership. So my question is, how much influence does Scotland National Party have in this broader Brexit battle? What are some centrifugal and centripetal forces in this potential independence drive,
good question.
given the current political climate in the EU?
Let me just interrupt and say, next time come with a thoughtful question.
That's a really good question. So where is Johnny, who was in my group earlier? Is he here? No, he's got other things to do. Tell Johnny from me, I'm annoyed. No. So he was from Scotland, and he was from the group of students. And he actually said to me that he had gone from being a Scottish National Party supporter when I was leader to being a Labour supporter as a result of Jeremy Corbyn's radicalism. I'm sort of paraphrasing, but more or less is what he said. And the point I made back to him was that Nicola Sturgeon, leader of the SNP and the First Minister of Scotland, thought that Brexit would be her route to independence, another independence referendum. Her problem is that a third of the SNP voters supported leave in the referendum. So when she said in the EU referendum, so when she said after the Brexit referendum, hey, I want to stay in the EU, so now we've got to break away from the United Kingdom, many of her supporters said, well, hang on a minute, we're not so sure about this. Support for independence is actually down. Support for a second referendum is down. She's taken it sort of backwards. Now, I'm not saying it's all plain sailing for the integrity of the United Kingdom. We should worry about that, particularly in relation to Northern Ireland, actually, which we didn't touch on, but is a really, really problematic issue for Brexit. So I think the Scottish issue is a dimension to this problem, to the Brexit conundrum. But my solution to the Scottish dimension and the whole dimension is respect the result, leave the European Union, but stay as close as possible to the EU because it's right economically, strategically, for foreign policy reasons. That means being a member of the customs union as close as possible to the so-called EU single market. So let's have a strong relationship with the EU even though we're outside it.
That's not a welcome solution among the Tories, though.
It's not, no, because they have this sort of ridiculous fantasy, in my view, of a sort of free-floating Britain, I guess as a sort of, Hong Kong of the North Sea or something. But it's such an illusion to think you get more influence with China or India or more of a relationship. If you're out with the relationship with the EU, you get more of it going through the EU.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was reported last week that the Royal Court, the theatre company, dropped a play about Tibet after directives from the British Council saying that such a play on such a sensitive topic would complicate relationships with China. And I would like you to comment on this matter, and also in a broader context, how would the UK uphold liberal democratic values both home and abroad, especially after Brexit, when it may be looking beyond the EU market for potential business and development opportunities?
Okay, on the Royal Court question, I wasn't aware. I was actually once on the board of the Royal Court, but not at the moment. I wasn't aware of it, so I'm not going to comment on the specific sort of artistic decision that they made. Look, on the wider relationship with China, I mean, I think that the only way forward for Britain and for other countries is engagement and constructive engagement. On the issue of climate change, I think what China is doing is incredibly important. I think one of the things that's changed since 2009, I had big criticism of China after Copenhagen, which wasn't welcome. But I think one of the things that's changed dramatically is the decisive decision that China has made to shift towards, I think I'm right in saying that China is installing more solar or renewable energy and electricity in the next up to 2030 than the whole of the European Union's electricity supply. I mean, the scale of change in China, and I think it's often not understood, is very big on climate. So whether it's climate or all the other issues you've got to engage, we're going to have different views on issues around human rights. I think it's right that we express those views and don't shy away from them on both sides. But I think you've got to have engagement. And I think we'll be strengthened in our engagement with China if we're closer to the EU rather than further away.
Thank you.
Hello. I want to touch Corbyn leadership from another angle. So it seems that Corbyn is very popular among the Labour base, and general polls also don't look too bad. But again and again, he's involved in anti-Semitic references, connection with anti-Semitic movement or people. And it seems that the Labour Party is walking into a kind of dark path. And I wonder, how do you see it? And what do you think it says about Britain and about British Labour voters if someone taken by anti-Semitism is relatively successful?
And let me just add to the question, because we talked about this in the Holocaust. Put it in the context of being the child of Holocaust survivor.
Yeah. What's your name?
So if what does it say about?
No, what's your name? Sorry.
Ramon.
Ramon.
Yeah.
Look, it's a really important question. First thing to say is, if the implication of your question is that Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite, I don't agree. I don't think he is. In fact, I know he isn't. I think it is right to say that there is a problem in sort of parts of the far left, he called it pockets of the far left, where legitimate criticism of the state of Israel and its actions spills over into anti-Semitism. There's going to be no place for that. And I think we as a party have got to be clear that there's no place for it. I think Jeremy has been clear that there is no place for it. And I think it's right that we act on that basis. But there was quite a good piece actually by Mark Mazawa in the New York Times a couple of days ago, which tried to sort of look behind some of this. So, you know, he's apologized rightly for what he said about that mural, which he hadn't seen. I take him at his word when he says that. But there can't be any place for that, and it's got to be dealt with. So that's my. Feel free to come back. I mean, David allowing, feel free to come back.
Okay. No, it's okay. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Mike. I'm an alum here. It's just a special room for me because I had my wedding reception here. But
congratulations.
Thank you.
Good place for a wedding reception.
How'd it go?
Very well. Expecting a child in a few days, actually.
Oh, congratulations.
All right.
Thank you. So my question is on the subject of a second referendum. The Parliament recently voted a few months ago that whatever the final agreement is, if there even is one, that the Parliament will have to approve said agreement, and Theresa May's own party, some of them crossed to vote against her. Do you think it's possible that if that agreement is not voted for in Parliament, that it could go back to the people for a second referendum?
I mean, disappointingly for some people who, you know, for understandable reasons are grief-struck by Brexit, I am a second referendum skeptic. I'm a second referendum skeptic because Kameron should have never called the referendum in the first place. But he went into the referendum saying this is a one-off referendum. You know, you walk through that door, he said, in faux Churchillian tones, and you make a sort of decision forever, either way, or for generations. I think it's and part of what motivated the Brexit result was a sort of anti-politics. I think it's very hard to come along afterwards and say, well, we know you voted partly for Brexit because of anti-politics, but we're now going to sort of have a do-over. I mean, I understand the desire for a do-over. And, you know, people say it was a crummy basis to have a referendum because you were voting for some destination you didn't know where you were going. But the problem was, we didn't go into the first referendum saying, we're going to have two, by the way. One where we negotiate an outcome, and two where we decide whether we like the outcome or not. And so I think it's very tricky. And the other more kind of applicable maybe point here is, you know, 48-52, let's say it was 52-48 the other way. Well, where's that going to sort of leave us? I think one thing that some of my colleagues on both sides maybe underestimate is this is not some winner-take-all game show. This is you've got to live together as a country forever after. And so I think going to the very good question about how do you sort of heal, bring people together, I think you've got to act on the referendum as best you can, which is honour the result, but stay as close as possible to the EU. So you respect the majority in the result, and you respect the significant minority when it comes to the precise Brexit outcome.
So I guess, sorry to follow up, but what do you think would happen if the Parliament voted against whatever agreement?
Well, I think that it is perfectly legitimate for Parliament to vote against the deal she comes back with, and she'd have to carry on negotiating. Look, if she comes back with a deal that says we're not going to be in the customs union, and the implication is you'll have a hard border in Northern Ireland. And by the way, this is an incredibly serious issue, this issue of the hard border. I mean, you know, we're 20 years today, I think, since the Good Friday Agreement, which was a great achievement of the Blair government. Credit to John Major, his predecessor Conservative, who sort of in a way started the process. It is, you know, there is a real risk here if you put up a border in between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And the only way you don't get a border, as far as I can tell, is by essentially having similar arrangements on either side of the border, and that means a customs union and some version of the single market. So,
but this is the Rubik's cube in which you're in, because
it is the Rubik's cube, but actually there is a solution to this Rubik's cube, which is, but it's anathema to lots of Theresa May's party. And so, I think there may well come a crunch where people vote down what she proposes.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Michael. I'm a first year at the law school. So you were elected labor leader under a different system than Corbyn was. And I was wondering, do you think, it seems to me that the leader of the Parliamentary Labour Party should have the support of his colleagues in Parliament. Do you think there's any chance that that system will go back and it won't just be the 35 signatures required, and whether that's a good thing? Because it seems to me like a whole generation of Labour frontbenchers have been wiped out during his leadership. And the other question was, do you think UK politics needs more Michael Goves?
Well, why'd you ask that?
I think he's an interesting guy.
So Michael Gove is a guy, for those who don't know, I don't quite know how to describe him politely. He was a guy who was, why do you like him actually?
He's a very vexing individual.
Yeah, he's a very intelligent guy. He was the education secretary. He was part of Boris Johnson's leadership campaign. It all went incredibly wrong. He then stood himself. That went wrong. He then got kicked out of the cabinet by Theresa May, and then he's come back as the environment minister. I'm not sure.
You changed the rules. We should point out it was under your leadership that the rules were changed in a way that advantaged Jeremy Corbyn.
On Michael Gove, there's only one Michael Gove, and I think we should keep it that way. I was throwing the payoff.
I'm sorry. I didn't want to stand between you and insulting the questioner.
It's a good strategy. On the rules, so I changed, for those who don't know, this is the sort of intricacies of British politics, I changed the rules to basically allow the party members and the wider franchise to elect the leader. And I totally defend that decision. I think that basically, and you have to get the nominations of a certain proportion of the parliamentary Labour Party, 15%. I think it may have gone down to 10 now. I totally defend that view. All self-respecting parties in Britain, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Democrats, elect their leader with the membership. You have to have a threshold. Now, I sort of think it's quite interesting, this, because it goes back to my point about humility. Too many people are trying to put Jeremy Corbyn's... He won in every section, by the way. He won among the members and these other sections that were introduced, not among the MPs, as you say. But I think there are too many people who want to sort of try and explain away his decision that it was to do with mechanics. I think it was because he was offering something that, inspired quite a lot of people. I think that's why he sort of won. So I defend the system. I think my answer to you on the people who are going to lose their, who are wasted talent is, I hope they can come back onto the front bench. I mean, I don't see absolutely no reason ideologically why they shouldn't. Because I think actually the ideological splits in the Labour Party are overdone.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm a first-year undergraduate in the college here. I think one of the big themes I've kind of heard from tonight's discussion has been, given big cultural megatrends like skyrocketing inequality, changes in technology and culture and economy, like what do we do? And it seems like, by and large, like my generation, young people, college students in both Britain and the United States, has turned increasingly to like the further left or the further right in order to present like that comprehensive vision that you were talking that Corbyn presents. So my question is, not just like, do you have the answers to those questions, but can the center and the center left give answers to those questions which aren't more of the same, more of the status quo, like more of the current social order?
I mean, I think it's an extremely good question. I think they've got to. I think this is a sort of wake up and smell the coffee moment for those people who consider themselves in the centre. And I really think that there is a sort of danger that they blame the voters for being sort of wrong or misguided or even stupid, or they blame the right for their fake news or whatever. You've got to actually look at the objective conditions of people's lives. The promise of capitalism was that people will grow more prosperous from generation to generation. They'll have if they work hard and play by the rules in the political cliche, they'll get a secure income for their family, secure pension, have decent health care. We're not delivering. It's simple. And unless the centre recognises that and recognises the need to deliver on that, the centre isn't going to get anywhere. If the centre just tells people it's too complicated to deliver that, or it's you've got to just accept that this is the way life is, it's just not going to work. So I think the centre can get back on, however you define the centre can get back on the pitch, but it's got to respond. And by the way, just implicit in what I just said, the centre is not a fixed point. I mean, it's so important, this. The centre moves around. It can move around as a result of political argument, or it can move around as a result of objective conditions. And so, I often think that the British media kind of underestimates, in some places, that the centre is more left than it realises.
Just one addendum to that question. We talk about capitalism.
Yeah.
And there are certain forces that drive capitalism. Yeah. And you talked about automation. Yeah. We've got artificial intelligence. Yeah. And the nature of work is changing.
Definitely.
And the big manufacturing
Totally.
we've seen in the past takes fewer people. The kind of jobs that your constituents had. So doesn't that complicate the answer?
Definitely. Look, it's not that the answers are going to be easy. But, what is the answer? The answer isn't to just say we're going to bring all the old jobs back. And let's be honest. By the way, my constituents.
So the caricature is that would be the one thing, and the other would be the government's going to take care of folks.
Yeah, but we're going to say, look, my constituents wouldn't say let's just bring all the old jobs back either. Because, coal mining was good in one sense because it gave people status and respect. And I think this is a big part of it, by the way, respect, recognition, yeah. Which you don't get. Dignity. Yeah. But what are the modern jobs? I think the renewable industries, if we really went for it on this green stuff, that can be part of it. I mean, is it going to be, how well paid is it going to be, all of that? I think the family economy, caring. I mean, older people and younger people, we're living longer. If you establish a decent care system at both ends of the age spectrum, that can be a source of work. Now, is that challenging for men to do some of that work? Yes, it is, but maybe that has got to be some of the answer. Things like the universal basic income. People working less is not a bad thing if you can find ways of sustaining it. But you've got to get onto the pitch on these, on some of these answers, I think.
Mm-hmm. Hi Ed, my name is Shaheen. I'm a second-year PhD student here.
What's your PhD on?
I do Persian literature.
Great.
But yeah, I'm a British citizen. I'm a member of the Labour Party. I actually joined when Jeremy Corbyn ran the first time round, as did a lot of people my age, because we were inspired by his much more progressive and radical platform.
Much better than the other previous guy, I'm joking.
I voted for you as well.
I'm having you on.
So where that was
don't
going.
worry. Yeah.
But it's been very interesting to hear you say that, to some extent, you acknowledged that a lot of his success has been down to a more kind of visionary style of politics. And as a Labour member and a Corbyn supporter, what's been very difficult since his election and disheartening is the kind of abuse and the ridicule and the denouncements of being naive and the proclamations that we were going to destroy the Labour Party and reduce it to 100 seats. And then obviously with the election and everything that happened, it was to some extent quite vindicating because, this bold platform actually did incredibly well. It was the biggest swing, it's easy to forget, from, was it 1945 in the Labour vote. So my question really is, despite all that, it's immensely disheartening to see still some members within the Labour movement sort of trying to undermine that project that's been so successful. A small minority, and much smaller than it was before, but they're still there, which I'm sure you'd agree. So my question is, do you think there is a place in the Labour movement for some of these people within the parliamentary party who still really seek to undermine what the Corbyn project's trying to achieve? Or another way of saying that is, what's your opinion on sort of mandatory reselection questions?
No, I'm not in favour of that. Look, that really is in the weeds. I mean, but it's important. I mean, this is about the idea that MPs have to go through not just every MP has to be reselected by their local party, but it will be a sort of more open contest. And now it sounds like I'm saying that because of self-interest. It's not that. I think the most important thing is the Labour Party looks outwards, not inwards. And I think that's true of everybody. That means respecting Jeremy's leadership. But it also means not going on a, kind of attempt to try and get people out. I mean, look, I take a view of the Labour Party that people have different views. This is my philosophy. People have different views across the party, but, those views need to be respected, and wisdom doesn't reside in one part of the Labour Party. One of the things about me is I can talk one week to Tony Blair and the next week to Jeremy Corbyn. I'm unusual in that respect. And I think both of them have interesting and important things to say. And so, I absolutely back Jeremy, and I absolutely back his programme. I think, what's important for all parts of the party is to get behind him, but everyone's got to reach out, I think. And that is the way forward, but not look inwards.
Hi, I'm Kenneth from the college first year. So we've been talking about how we live in a time when there are two sides of the digital divide. And so a logical solution would be funding more re-education programs for computer science to satisfy the job opportunities of this new age.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess my question is, in your experience, why has this sort of logical solution failed to bring the two sides of the divide together as strictly sound economic policy? How can we approach this problem that will be a focal point of world politics moving forward in the next 30 years?
That's a really good question, isn't it? I think the question will be better than the answer. I think the truth is that government, as I said earlier, is lumbering and slow. And I think has been too slow to recognize the revolution that technology is going to bring. I think that people say about these technological changes that people tend to overestimate their impact in the short term and underestimate their impact in the long term. I think that's probably right. So we're not all going to be in driverless cars tomorrow, but there's no doubt that the whole auto industry is going to have a revolution when it comes to 20, 25 years. But I think partly what's implicit in your question is making the case for government's role in this. You see, the Gene Sperling, who used to be the chief economic advisor to President Obama and Clinton, said to me once, and it's always stuck in my mind, he said, the thing you've got to understand about gains that accrue to the impact of trade on a country is that the gains are narrowly spread, but the penalties are widely spread, but the penalties are narrowly focused. So somebody loses their job in Ohio, everybody gets, or lots of people get cheaper goods at Walmart. But it's a small impact on everybody getting cheaper goods at Walmart, but quite a big impact on the guy in Ohio. What is the answer to that? Right. The answer to that has to be government. Because who else is going to provide the redistribution of the rewards and risks that come with trade or technology? The answer isn't to say we're not going to trade anymore, or we're going to cut technology off, and we don't want this technology. The answer is you've got to have a role for government in redistributing those benefits and burdens so they're fairly shared. Yeah. And I think that, in a way, is the sort of, that's the fundamental, but it's a great question.
But as you say, a job is about more than a paycheck. It's about dignity. It's about a sense of self-worth. And the question the point you were making about what role government has to play in terms of preparing people for some of these opportunities. Not everybody's going to make that transition, is important. Anyway, it's always good to see you. You're as thoughtful as ever.
Great audience.
Yes, and they're very thoughtful too.
Good place to have a wedding, we now know as well.
Yes. Exactly, and he seemed very happy.
Yeah, exactly.
It all worked out. Well, we're very happy that you're here, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.